Your hips are at 90 degrees right now. They have been at 90 degrees for most of the hours you have been awake today, and most of the hours you were awake yesterday, and the day before that. Seated at breakfast. Seated in the car. Seated at the desk. Seated at dinner. Seated watching this. The position has a cost, and the cost is measured not in discomfort, but in tissue that has remodeled around the angle, in joint surfaces that have stopped receiving nutrition, in a muscle capacity that has been quietly eliminated over 50 years of the same posture. In Okinawa, the oldest living population on Earth eats dinner sitting on tatami mats on the floor. In Sardinia, the second longest lived population sits on low wooden stools and stone benches. In the villages of Ikaria, Greece, the elderly sit in low chairs or on the ground to tend gardens. In Nicoya, Costa Rica, centenarians sit on hammocks and low platforms. In Loma Linda, California, the Seventh-day Adventist community that outlives every surrounding population gathers in homes and gardens on low seating and floor cushions. Dan Buettner, who studied these 5 blue zone populations for National Geographic, documented a pattern that nobody in the medical establishment has taken seriously. The longest-lived populations on Earth do not sit in chairs. They sit on or near the ground, and they get up from the ground dozens of times a day for their entire lives. The piece of furniture your body is in right now is absent from every culture that produces the most centenarians. That might be coincidence. The biomechanics suggests it is not, and the mechanism is specific. There is a test, scored out of 10, requiring nothing but a floor, that predicted all-cause mortality more accurately than blood pressure in a study of 2,000 adults. There is a joint nutrition mechanism that depends entirely on mechanical loading through range, and that chair sitting restricts to a single surface. And there is a reason a 3-year-old can sit in a deep squat for 10 minutes, while a 65-year-old cannot. And the reason is not aging, it is furniture. All of it comes later. Start with the mortality data, because the numbers are difficult to dismiss. In 2012, Claudio Gil Araujo, the same researcher whose 10-second one-leg balance test measured neurological integration speed in an earlier episode, published a study at Clinimex in Rio de Janeiro measuring something different, not how fast 4 sensory systems communicate, but whether the musculoskeletal system can still produce strength, flexibility, and coordination through its full range. 2002 adults, aged 51 to 80, were asked to sit down on the floor from standing, and stand back up without using their hands, knees, or any external support. Each movement was scored out of 5 points. 5 for sitting down with no support, 5 for standing back up with no support, for a maximum composite score of 10. Every time a participant used a hand, a knee, or the side of a leg for support, 1 point was deducted. Every wobble or loss of balance cost half a point. The scoring was biomechanical, not subjective. Each deduction corresponded to a specific compensatory movement that the body was using to substitute for a capacity it no longer had. A hand placed on the floor during the descent means the hip extensors cannot control the lowering through full range. A knee touching down means the quadriceps cannot generate enough eccentric force to manage the deceleration. A wobble means the proprioceptive cerebellar loop cannot maintain balance through the transition. Each deduction is a specific system reporting its degradation through a compensatory movement the person may not even realize they are performing. The test does not ask which system is failing, it reads the failure in the movement itself. Cohort was followed for a median of 6.3 years. Participants who scored in the lowest category, 0 to 3 points, had a 5 to 6 times higher all-cause mortality rate than those who scored 8 to 10. After adjusting for age, sex, and BMI, each 1-point increase in the composite score was associated with a 21% reduction in mortality risk. Getting up from the floor without help predicted whether you would be alive in 6 years more accurately than your blood pressure. Think about that, a test requiring no equipment, no blood draw, no imaging, no physician. Just a floor and 10 seconds of movement. Predicted death from all causes with a statistical power that most clinical diagnostics cannot approach. The question is, what the floor is testing that the clinic is not? Well, and the answer begins with what the chair eliminated. Because a chair is not a neutral resting position. It is a specific biomechanical environment that the body adapts to over decades, and the adaptation has costs that are invisible until they are measured. A standard chair places the hips and knees at approximately 90 degrees of flexion. The ankle remains near neutral. The spine is either supported by a backrest or unsupported at approximately 90 degrees of hip to trunk angle. This is one position, one configuration of the musculoskeletal system held for hours, repeated daily for decades. Sitting on the floor requires the body to adopt multiple configurations. Cross-legged sitting uses 90 to 120 degrees of hip flexion with external rotation and abduction. Kneeling uses maximal knee flexion at approximately 150 degrees. Squatting uses deep hip and knee flexion simultaneously with ankle dorsiflexion. Side sitting uses asymmetric hip rotation. Each position loads different joint surfaces, stretches different muscle groups, and activates different stabilizer chains. Floor sitting exposes the hip joint to approximately 30 distinct positional configurations that chair sitting eliminates entirely, a difference documented by biomechanist Katie Bowman across 2 decades of movement variability research. 30 configurations versus 1. The difference is not preference. It is mechanical input to every tissue in the hip complex, cartilage, capsule, ligament, muscle, tendon, over the course of a lifetime. Hip joint in a chair, sitting life receives the mechanical equivalent of eating one food for every meal. The superior weight-bearing surface is loaded continuously. The posterior capsule tightens from never being stretched. The external rotators shorten from never being asked to rotate. The ankle dorsiflexors stiffen from never being taken past neutral. Every tissue adapts to the single position it is given, and the adaptation is a loss of the capacity to assume any other position. The body does not lose range of motion from aging. It loses range of motion from not using range of motion. The chair provides the narrowest range input of any seated posture available to the human skeleton. The body adapts accordingly. Now, what happens to the tissues that receive only one configuration for 50 years? Because the hip flexor problem is where most of the damage accumulates, and the mechanism is specific. Iliopsoas. The primary hip flexor originates from the lumbar vertebrae and iliac fossa and inserts on the lesser trochanter of the femur. In a seated position, the iliopsoas is in a shortened state. Sustained shortening across months and years produces adaptive shortening. The muscle and its associated fascia remodel at the shorter length through a process that is measurable at the cellular level. Sarcomeres are removed in series, reducing the muscle's resting length, and the connective tissue matrix remodels around the new, shorter configuration. When the person stands, the shortened iliopsoas pulls the lumbar spine into increased lordosis, an anterior pelvic tilt that changes the mechanical loading of every structure in the lower back. Lumbar facet joints are compressed. Intervertebral discs experience asymmetric loading, greater compression posteriorly, greater tension anteriorly. Erector spinae muscles work harder to maintain upright posture against the pull of the shortened hip flexors. Lower back pain, that millions of people attribute to aging, to disc degeneration, to genetics. A significant fraction of it originates in adaptive shortening of the iliopsoas from decades of chair sitting. The muscle shortened because the chair held it short. The spine compensated for the shortened muscle. The compensation produced pain. The pain produced inactivity. The inactivity produced more shortening. The cycle is biomechanical, not mysterious, and it begins with the 90-degree hip angle the chair imposes. Medical response typically addresses the pain rather than the shortened muscle that produced it. The therapy treats the consequence while the chair recreates the cause 8 hours later. You see, a species that evolved to squat, kneel, and sit cross-legged for 2 million years adopted a piece of furniture 5,000 years ago that holds its primary hip flexor in a shortened position for 8 to 12 hours a day. The muscle remodeled. The spine compensated. And the medical system treats the resulting pain as a disease of aging rather than a consequence of furniture. Now, what the skeleton was actually built for, because the deep squat is not an exercise. It is a resting position that every human body was designed to use, and that chair, using populations have lost through disuse, not through aging. Deep squat, heels flat, hips below knees, spine relatively upright, is a resting position for every toddler on Earth. Watch a 2-year-old pick something up from the ground. They do not bend at the waist. They drop into a full-depth squat, heels flat, spine neutral, and rest there, comfortably, without effort, for as long as the task requires. Every healthy human skeleton accommodates this position. The hip sockets, the knee joints, the ankle joints, the spinal curves, all of them evolved to permit a full-depth squat as a primary resting posture. Toddler is not performing an exercise. They are using the resting position their skeleton was designed for, the position that distributes their weight across the largest possible base of support while keeping the center of mass low. Adults in non-chair cultures use this position for rest, for work, for waiting, for cooking, for socializing. It is the default. The chair is the aberration. The deep squat is what the human skeleton expects to do when it is not standing or lying down. Loss of the deep squat and chair using populations is not genetic. It is adaptive. The tissues that permit deep squatting, the ankle dorsiflexors, the hip external rotators, the deep hip flexors, the knee flexors, shorten and stiffen when they are never taken through full range. Joint capsules tighten. Motor patterns for entering and exiting the squat are pruned from the motor cortex through disuse. The neural pathways that coordinated the movement as a toddler are deprioritized when the movement stops occurring. Research published in the Journal of Physiological Anthropology by Kasuyama and colleagues documented that populations with lifelong floor-sitting habits maintain deep squat capacity into their 80s, full depth, heels flat, sustained without discomfort. Chair-sitting populations lose it as early as their 40s. The skeleton does not change between these populations. The soft tissues around it adapt to the range they are asked to use. One population asks for 120 degrees of hip flexion with external rotation dozens of times daily. The other asks for 90 degrees in a single plane, held statically, for hours. Body built itself around the furniture it was given. A 3-year-old can deep squat because every tissue in their body has been moving through that range since they could stand. A 65-year-old who has sat in chairs for 50 years cannot deep squat because every tissue in their body has remodeled around the 90-degree chair position. The skeleton is identical. The soft tissue envelope is different. The difference is 50 years of positional input. Person who stopped sitting on the floor at age 15, who chose the couch, the desk chair, the car seat, the restaurant booth, the airline seat, the office chair, the cinema seat, the waiting room chair, has been removing from their daily life, for 50 years, the positional variety that their hip joints, knee joints, ankle joints, and spinal segments required to maintain their full range. They did not make a conscious decision to lose their deep squat. They made a series of furniture choices that, accumulated over decades, produced the same result. The chair is not a resting position. It is a mold. The body conformed to it. And here is why the rising matters more than the sitting, because this is where the mortality data concentrates. Predictive power of the sitting-rising test is not primarily in the sitting. It is in the rising. Getting up from the floor without support requires a specific sequence of coordinated actions, shifting the center of mass over the base of support, generating concentric force through the hip extensors and knee extensors from a position of deep flexion, maintaining balance through a transitional phase where the base of support is narrow and the center of mass is high, and controlling the deceleration as the body reaches full standing. This sequence loads the gluteus maximus through its full range, a muscle that barely activates during chair, to standing transitions because the 90-degree starting position bypasses its peak force production angle. The gluteus maximus is the largest muscle in the human body, the primary hip extensor, and the muscle most responsible for generating the force required to stand from a deep position. Its peak force production occurs at deep hip flexion, angles below 90 degrees, precisely the range that a chair eliminates. Standing from a chair uses the quadriceps through a modest range. Standing from the floor demands the gluteus maximus through its full range. Consequence of decades without deep-range gluteal activation is gluteal amnesia, a clinical term for a gluteus maximus that has been neurologically downregulated through chronic disuse. The motor cortex reduces the excitatory signal to a muscle that is not being asked to produce force at its peak range. The muscle atrophies selectively at the deep flexion fiber lengths. The hip extensors, that should be the primary engine for standing from the floor, become secondary to the compensatory patterns. The hand on the knee, the forward lean, the momentum-based heave. That the body develops when the gluteals cannot do the job. Transition demands single-leg balance during the phase where one leg is planted and the other is repositioning. It requires ankle dorsiflexion range that chair sitting eliminates. It tests proprioceptive integration under load. The foot, ankle, knee, and hip proprioceptors must provide continuous positional data to the cerebellum while the body moves through an unstable transitional posture. Every floor-to-standing transition is a micro-test of the systems that RU's mortality study measured: strength through range, joint flexibility, balance under load, and motor coordination across multiple joints simultaneously. People in floor-sitting cultures perform this transition dozens of times daily, rising from meals, from conversation, from rest, from work. Each transition is a training stimulus. Each stimulus maintains the capacity the test measures. Chair-sitting populations perform this transition approximately 0 times per day. The test that predicts mortality measures a capacity trained entirely by the floor and entirely eliminated by the chair. Cumulative difference across a lifetime is categorical, not incremental. A person in a floor-sitting culture arrives at age 80, having performed the floor to standing movement pattern thousands of times per year for decades, each repetition loading the gluteus maximus through full range, requiring single-leg balance through the transition phase, cycling the hip and ankle through deep flexion, demanding proprioceptive integration under load. A person in a chair-sitting culture arrives at age 80 having performed this movement almost never. The chair did not merely reduce the stimulus, it eliminated it. That pattern, the longest-lived populations maintaining a movement capacity that the mortality data identifies as the strongest predictor of survival through nothing more than the absence of a piece of furniture, is the finding that made the floor-sitting research land differently for me. The correlation does not isolate floor-sitting from the dozens of other blue zone factors: diet, social integration, purpose, moderate activity, plant-heavy eating. The biomechanics cannot claim that floor-sitting is why these populations outlive everyone. What the biomechanics can claim is specific. The mechanism by which floor-sitting maintains musculoskeletal function is established. The mortality association with the capacity it maintains is replicated, and every blue zone population shares this variable alongside all the others. Whether it is a contributor, a marker, or an independent factor, the mechanistic pathway from floor to function is real regardless of where it ranks in the causal hierarchy. Now, the physics of why the joint itself needs the movement. Because cartilage nutrition depends on mechanical loading in a way that most people have never been told. Articular cartilage, the smooth, resilient tissue covering the ends of bones inside joints, has no blood supply. None. Unlike muscle, unlike bone, unlike virtually every other tissue in the body, cartilage cannot receive nutrients from the bloodstream because no blood vessels penetrate it. It receives its nutrients through diffusion from synovial fluid, the viscous liquid that fills the joint cavity. Diffusion is not passive. It is driven by mechanical loading and unloading. When the joint is compressed, fluid is squeezed out of the cartilage matrix like water from a sponge. When the compression is released, fluid is drawn back in, carrying oxygen, glucose, and the molecular building blocks the chondrocytes need to maintain the cartilage structure. This is imbibition, a pump driven by movement, not by heartbeat, and it is the sole mechanism by which cartilage stays alive. Cycle requires variation. Compression must alternate with release. Loading must shift from one surface to another. A joint that is compressed continuously in one position does not cycle fluid, it squeezes it out and holds it out. A joint that is unloaded continuously does not draw fluid in. No compression means no imbibition. Cartilage needs intermittent, varied, cyclical loading to survive. The deep squat loads different surfaces than the cross-legged sit. The cross-legged sit loads different surfaces than the kneeling position. Each transition between positions is a pump cycle, compressing one region and releasing another, driving nutrients into surfaces that the previous position starved. Cartilage that is not cyclically loaded does not receive adequate nutrition. The surface degrades. Chondrocyte metabolism declines without mechanical stimulation. Osteoarthritis begins, not from overuse, but from underuse of specific joint surfaces. Hip joint, sitting in a chair at 90 degrees, loads the superior weight-bearing surface of the acetabulum and the femoral head continuously, while the posterior, anterior, and inferior surfaces receive minimal loading. The cartilage on the loaded surfaces is compressed without adequate unloading cycles, squeezed continuously without the release phase that draws nutrients back in. The cartilage on the unloaded surfaces is starved of nutrient exchange entirely. No compression means no imbibition, means no nutrition. Hip joint that moves through the full range of floor, sitting, cross-legged, kneeling, squatting, side-sitting, distributes compressive loading across the entire articular surface, cycling fluid through every region of cartilage with every positional change. Cross-legged sitting loads the posterior inferior surface of the femoral head. Kneeling loads the posterior surface under full flexion. Deep squatting loads the anterior superior surface under combined flexion and compression. Each position feeds a different region of cartilage. The joint is fed by movement through range. The chair restricts the feeding to one surface. Osteoarthritis that develops on the neglected surfaces is not wear and tear. The phrase itself is misleading, implying that movement causes the damage. The damage comes from the absence of movement. Cartilage that is loaded cyclically through varied positions maintains its matrix, maintains its chondrocyte metabolism, maintains its thickness. Cartilage that is loaded statically in one position or not loaded at all degrades through nutrient deprivation. The hip replacement that a 70-year-old receives is replacing a joint surface that was starved, not worn. The physics of the degradation is specific and mechanical. The question is whether it reverses. Well, and the adaptive shortening that chair sitting produces is reversible, within limits set by age and the severity of the adaptation, but reversible. The direction of the remodeling depends on the signal the tissue receives. Soft tissue remodels in both directions. Muscles lengthen when held at longer lengths over time. Sarcomeres are added in series, the inverse of the shortening process that chair sitting produced. Joint capsules stretch when moved through increased range. The collagen matrix remodels over weeks and months in response to the mechanical signal of sustained stretch. Motor patterns for deep squatting and floor transitions can be relearned. The motor cortex retains plasticity for fundamental movement patterns throughout life, because these patterns were never genetically lost. They were experientially suppressed. The neural architecture for squatting is still present. It has been deprioritized by decades of non-use, not deleted. First weeks of floor sitting in a body adapted to chairs are uncomfortable, not because the floor is harmful, but because the tissues are being asked to assume positions they have not held in decades. The hip external rotators protest against cross-legged sitting. The ankles resist dorsiflexion. The knees ache in deep flexion.